Thomas Mitchell sat in the bright television studio, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his blue tie for the third time. The red recording light glowed above the main camera like a warning beacon in the night. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that hummed quietly in the background. This was it, the moment that could make or break everything he had worked for. Across from him, Catherine Wells ranged her papers with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her dark suit impeccable. She had interviewed prime ministers who stumbled over their words, presidents who lost their temper, and celebrities who broke down in tears. But tonight felt different to her too. There was something in the air, a tension that made even her experienced hands pause for just a moment. The studio buzzed with quiet activity. Camera operators adjusted their positions. Sound technicians checked their levels one final time. The makeup artist had finished her work 20 minutes ago. But Thomas could still smell the powder on his face. It felt heavy, like a mask he was not used to wearing. 30 seconds, called out the floor manager. Holding up his fingers, Thomas took a deep breath and tried to remember what his media coach had taught him. Sit up straight. Make eye contact. Speak clearly. But all the coaching in the world could not prepare him for what was coming. Catherine looked directly into the camera with the ease of someone who had done this for 30 years. Good evening. And welcome to Evening Focus. I'm Catherine Wells. And tonight we're speaking with Thomas Mitchell, candidate for Parliament, about his campaign and his vision for our community. The interview began with standard questions. Thomas felt himself relaxing slightly as they discussed his policies on healthcare, education, and the economy. These were topics he knew well, issues he had spent months preparing for. His voice grew stronger, more confident in the control room. The producer nodded approvingly. But Catherine was building up to something. Thomas could sense it in the way she shifted in her chair, the slight change in her tone. He had heard rumors about what was coming, whispers from other politicians who had faced similar moments. Still, when it came, it hit him like a punch to the stomach. Mr. Mitchell, Catherine began, her voice taking on a sharp edge. Many voters are concerned about your strong Christian beliefs. Some are asking, are you perhaps too Christian for a public office? Can someone with such firm religious views truly represent everyone in our diverse society? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, then began racing faster than it had in years. This was the moment he had both expected and dreaded since the day he decided to run for office. In the control room, producers leaned forward in their chairs. The social media team was already watching, their screens light up with comments and shares. Within seconds, the clip would be circulating online, dissected and analyzed by thousands of people he would never meet. Millions of viewers across the country had stopped what they were doing. In living rooms and kitchens, people put down their cups of tea and turned up the volume. This was the kind of moment that could define not just a career, but a national conversation. Thomas felt the studio lights growing hotter against his skin. The silence stretched longer than it should have, each second feeling like an eternity. He could hear his own heart beat in his ears, could feel the weight of every eye in the room watching him. His mind raced back to his late wife, Emma, who had died 3 years ago after a long battle with cancer. Even in her final days, she had held his hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll never hide who you are, Thomas. The world needs honest people, especially in difficult times." He thought of his daughter, Lucy, who was 22 and studying at university. She would be watching at home, probably with her flatmates gathered round their small television. She had supported his decision to run for office, but he knew she worried about the personal cost. Would she be proud of what he said next, or would she watch her father crumble under pressure? The studio remained silent except for the quiet hum of equipment. Catherine's eyes remained fixed on him, patient but expectant. She had asked the question that everyone wanted to ask, but few had the courage to voice. Directly. Thomas knew that. His next words would be remembered, quoted, and analyzed for years to come. The silence stretched on, heavy with possibility and consequence. In those few seconds of silence that felt like hours, Thomas's mind pulled him back through the years, like pages turning in an old photo album. The studio lights dimmed in his consciousness as memories flooded in, each one more vivid than the last. He was 8 years old again, sitting at his grandmother Margaret's worn woodland kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through her faded, yellow curtains, casting warm patterns on the checkered tablecloth. She was a small woman with gentle hands and silver hair that she kept in a simple bun. After his parents died in that terrible car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening, she had taken him in without question every morning, before she made his breakfast. Grandmother Margaret would fold her hands and close her eyes. Her prayer was always the same, spoken in her soft Scottish accent. "Help us love others better today." It was not a long prayer or a complicated one. Just 7 simple words that seemed to mean everything to her. Thomas remembered how safe he felt in that little kitchen, with its smell of fresh bread and lavender soap. His grandmother never talked about religion like it was something scary or demanding. To her, faith was as natural as breathing, as simple as choosing to be kind to the mailman or helping a neighbor carry groceries. The memory shifted. And suddenly he was 25 years old, sitting in a different kind of room. The rehabilitation center smelled of disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long. His hands shook as he tried to hold a plastic cup of water. The alcohol had nearly destroyed everything. His job, his relationships, his hope for any kind of future. Pastor William had visited him there every week. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a laugh that filled whatever room he entered. He never preached or lectured. Instead, he brought books about second chances and stories about people who had found their way back from dark places. Faith isn't about being perfect, Thomas, Pastor William had said during one of those visits, his voice gentle but firm. It's about being real. It's about admitting when you're broken and believing that broken things can be made whole again. Thomas remembered how those words had felt like cool water on a burning day. For the first time in months, he had felt something other than shame. He had felt hope. The memories continued to flow. He saw Emma's face on their wedding day, her eyes bright with joy and promise. She had been the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but it was her heart that had captured him completely. She believed in him even when he struggled to believe in himself. When the cancer came, Emma faced it with a courage that amazed everyone who knew her. She never complained, never asked why me. Instead, she used her illness as a reason to love more deeply, to appreciate each day more fully. During her final weeks, when the pain was almost unbearable, she had held his hand with her thin fingers. "Your faith doesn't make you weak, Thomas," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of hospital machines. "It makes you brave enough to care about things that matter. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." The memories shifted again, showing him snapshots of the years since Emma's death. He saw himself at the local food bank, sorting cans and vegetables alongside volunteers from every background imaginable. There was Mrs. Ahmed, who wore a colorful headscarf and always brought homemade cookies. There was David, a young man who had lost his job and was working to get back on his feet. There was elderly Mr. Peterson, who came not because he needed food, but because he needed community. He remembered the flooding 2 years ago, when the river had burst its banks and destroyed dozens of homes. Thomas had worked for 3 days straight, helping families salvage what they could from the muddy water. He had not asked anyone about their religion or their politics. He had simply helped because help was needed. He saw himself sitting with Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor, who had no family left. Every Sunday after church, he would visit her small apartment, bringing groceries and staying for a tea. She would tell him stories about her late husband and show him old photographs. Sometimes she would cry, and he would just sit with her, offering the comfort of presence. These memories were not about politics or power. They were about service and love, about the simple act of caring for other people because they were human beings who deserved dignity and kindness. Thomas blinked and found himself back in the studio. Catherine was still watching him, waiting for his response. The cameras were still rolling. Millions of people were still watching, judging, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. But now he knew exactly who he was and why he was there. Thomas took a deep breath that seemed to fill not just his lungs, but his entire being. The silence in the studio had stretched long enough. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a strength that surprised even himself. "Catherine, I understand the concern," he began, his words measured and clear, "but I'd like to respectfully challenge the premise of your question. My faith doesn't disqualify me from serving others. It compels me to serve them better." The words flowed from him naturally, as if they had been waiting inside him for years. There was no hesitation now, no nervous fidgeting with his tie. Thomas had found his center, and from that place of calm certainty, he continued, "My Christian beliefs teach me that every person has dignity and worth. They call me to fight for justice, to care for the poor, to protect the vulnerable. These aren't partisan values. They're human values that people of all backgrounds can understand and support." Catherine shifted in her chair, her professional mask slipping just slightly. She had expected a defensive response, perhaps some political double talk about separation of church and state. Instead, she was hearing something that sounded genuine and scripted. "But what about those who don't share your faith?" she pressed, raising an eyebrow. "Can you truly represent them fairly? Won't your religious convictions create conflicts when making decisions that affect people who believe differently than you do?" Thomas smiled gently, and for a moment the harsh studio lights seemed to soften round him. "Some of my closest friends are Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and people who don't believe in God at all. My faith doesn't teach me to exclude them. It teaches me to love them as neighbors. When I see someone struggling, I don't ask about their religion. I ask how I can help." He paused, thinking of the people who had become so important to him over the years. There was David, his Jewish advisor who had helped him understand the complexities of local government. David had lost family members in the Holocaust, yet he had never let that tragedy turn him bitter. Instead, he channeled his pain into a fierce commitment to justice for all people. Then there was Priya, his Hindu campaign manager, who had immigrated to the country as a child. She worked harder than anyone he knew, driven by a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunities she had been given. Her family celebrated Diwali with the same joy that Thomas's family celebrated Christmas, and he had learned that light conquering darkness was a universal human hope. And James, his atheist chief of staff, who had initially been skeptical about working for someone with strong religious convictions. But over months of working together, James had seen that Thomas's faith made him more compassionate, not less. James often joked that Thomas was the most Christian person he knew, and he meant it as the highest compliment. "Faith at its best doesn't divide us," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. It reminds us that we're all part of the same human family. Whether someone prays in a church, a mosque, a synagogue, or not at all, we all want the same basic things: safety for our families, opportunities for our children, dignity in our work, and hope for the future. The studio remained silent, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The tension that had filled the room moments before was dissolving, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. Even Catherine seemed touched by his sincerity, her usual professional distance giving way to genuine interest. Thomas looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to Catherine, but to everyone watching at home. I've spent my life trying to live out my faith through service. I've worked alongside people of every background, every religion, every political view. What I've learned is that when we focus on our shared humanity rather than our differences, amazing things can happen. He thought of the community garden they had started in the poorest part of town, where families from a dozen different countries worked side by side, sharing seeds and stories and meals. He thought of the interfaith council that had formed after the flooding, bringing together religious leaders who had never spoken before but who discovered they cared about the same things. My faith teaches me to be humble, Thomas said quietly. It reminds me that I don't have all the answers, that I need to listen to others, that I need to admit when I'm wrong. These seem like pretty good qualities for someone in public office. Catherine nodded slowly, her usual sharp demeanor softening. For the first time in the interview, she seemed to be hearing not a politician giving rehearsed answers, but a human being sharing his deepest convictions with honesty and grace. The cameras kept rolling, but the interview had become something more than television. It had become a moment of genuine human connection. Within minutes of the interview ending, the digital world erupted like a firework display across the night sky. Thomas had barely left the studio when his phone began buzzing, with notifications that seemed to never stop. The hashtag authentic leadership appeared on social media platforms and began spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. In living rooms across the country, people who had been watching the interview reached for their phones and computers. The response was unlike anything political observers had seen before. Instead of the usual angry debates and harsh criticisms, something different was happening. People were sharing the interview clip with words like inspiring and refreshing and finally, someone real. At the local mosque on Elm Street, Imam Hassan had been preparing for evening prayers when several members of his congregation approached him. They had watched the interview together in the community room, and now they wanted to talk about what they had heard. "What did you think of his answer?" asked Fatima, a young mother who taught at the local primary school. Imam Hassan considered his words carefully. "I may not share his faith, but I respect his honesty. We need more leaders who speak from a heart instead of from a script." When he talked about serving all people, I heard something genuine. The conversation continued as more people joined them. They talked about how rare it was to hear a politician speak with such sincerity, regardless of their religious background. By the end of the evening, several members had decided to volunteer for Thomas's campaign, not because they agreed with everything he believed, but because they trusted his character. Meanwhile, at the university coffee shop downtown, 20-year-old Rebecca sat with her laptop, typing furiously on her blog. She had started writing about politics during her first year of studies, and her posts usually focused on policy details and campaign strategies. But tonight felt different. "I'm not religious," she wrote, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I haven't been inside a church since I was a child, and I honestly wasn't sure what to think about Thomas Mitchell's strong faith. But after watching that interview, I believe something I never thought possible, that faith and public service can work together beautifully. She paused, thinking about her own grandmother who had been deeply religious but never judgmental. Mitchell didn't try to convert anyone or claim his beliefs were superior. He just showed how his faith makes him want to serve others better. That's something I can respect. Even if I don't share his beliefs, Rebecca posted her blog entry, and within hours it had been shared hundreds of times by students across the country. Comments poured in from young people who had never considered that religious conviction and inclusive leadership could coexist. Back at Thomas's campaign headquarters, the phones had been ringing non-stop. Sarah, his campaign volunteer, could barely keep up with the calls. Mary, a retired teacher from the next town over, was one of the first to call. "I've been teaching for 35 years. Mary said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've always tried to bring my faith into my work by treating every child with love and respect. But sometimes I felt like I had to hide that part of myself tonight." Thomas Mitchell made me proud to be a person of faith in public service. Even the criticism that came in felt different. People who disagreed with Thomas's view still commented on his honesty and authenticity. "I don't agree with his politics," wrote one social media user, "but at least he's not pretending to be something he's not. We need more honest people in government, even if we disagree with them." The most emotional call came from Lucy, Thomas's daughter. She had been watching from her university flat with her roommates, and when she called her father, she was crying happy tears. "Dad, you were amazing," she said between sobs. "You didn't hide who you are, and you didn't attack anyone either. You just loved. You showed everyone that you can be true to your faith and still care about people who are different from you." Thomas sat in his car outside the television studio, listening to his daughter's voice and feeling overwhelmed by the response. This was not what he had expected when he had walked into that interview. Letters and emails began arriving from across the country. A rabbi in Manchester wrote, "Your words reminded me why I entered community service in the first place. Thank you for showing that faith can be a bridge, not a wall." A Hindu family in Birmingham sent flowers to his office with a simple note. "Thank you for showing that faith can unite, not divide. You give us hope for our children's future." The interview clip was being shared millions of times, but not as a political weapon or a source of division. People were sharing it as inspiration, as proof that in a world full of calculated responses and careful messaging, someone could still speak from the heart. Years later, when people look back on that television interview, they remembered it not as a political moment, but as something much more important. Thomas Mitchell's response had become a lesson that teachers shared with their students, that parents told their children, and that people of all backgrounds used as an example of how to live with integrity. The interview was now studied in schools across the country, not in political science classes, but in courses about character and leadership. Students would watch the clip and then discuss what it meant to stay true to yourself while serving others. Teachers found that the story sparked conversations about respect, authenticity, and the difference between conviction and stubbornness. At Springfield High School, Mrs. Peterson had been showing the interview to her students for 3 years running. Every time, she watched their faces change as they listened to Thomas speak. He didn't get angry or defensive. One student observed, "He just explained who he was and why that made him want to help people." The small church where Thomas had found healing during his darkest days had changed too. Pastor William, now older, but still filled with the same gentle wisdom, had worked with the congregation to put up a simple brass plaque near the entrance. It read, "Faith in action is love in service to all." Below it, in smaller letters, were the words, "In memory of Emma Mitchell, who showed us what this means." Young people from different backgrounds would visit the church, not always for religious reasons, but because they had heard the story. They came to see the place where someone had learned that faith and service could work together. The church had become a symbol of hope for anyone who felt torn between their beliefs and their desire to help others. Sarah, now a university student studying social work, had written her final year project about the church. "This is where I learned that you don't have to choose between being true to yourself and caring for others," she wrote. "You can be both authentic and inclusive at the same time." Thomas had won that election, but more importantly, he had changed how people talked about faith in public life. His victory speech had been short and simple. "This isn't about one religion or one way of thinking. This is about all of us working together to build a better community." His administration became known for bringing people together rather than driving them apart. The team he assembled reflected this philosophy perfectly. Amira, his Muslim deputy, had a background in education and social services. She often joked that she and Thomas disagreed on theology, but agreed on everything that mattered. For their work, David, his Jewish chief of staff, brought years of experience in local government. He had been skeptical about working for someone with such strong religious convictions. But over time he had seen that Thomas's faith made him more committed to justice, not less. James, his atheist press secretary, had become one of Thomas's closest advisers. "I never thought I'd say this," James told a reporter, "but working with Thomas has made me understand that faith doesn't have to be the enemy of reason when it's done right. It can be a source of wisdom and compassion." The three men, along with the rest of the diverse team, worked together with a unity that surprised everyone, including themselves. They were united not by shared beliefs about God, but by shared values of service and compassion. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit in his garden behind the house he had shared with Emma. The roses she had planted were blooming again, their sweet scent filling the air. He would think about her and about his grandmother Margaret, feeling their presence in the gentle breeze and the fading light. Sometimes he could almost hear their voices whispering the truth he had discovered through years of struggle and growth, that the highest form of faith is love in action. It was not about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about caring enough to serve others, even when it was difficult, even when people questioned your motives. The interview question that had once seemed like a trap had become a doorway. It had opened not just the path to political office, but to a life of authentic service that honored both his deepest convictions and his commitment to every person he served. Thomas often received letters from young people who had seen the interview and felt inspired to enter public service themselves. A Hindu woman wrote to say she was running for a city council. A Jewish man had started a food bank in his neighborhood. A Muslim teenager had organized a community cleanup project. "You showed us that we don't have to hide who we are to serve others," one letter read. "You proved that authenticity and service can go hand in hand." As the sun set over his garden, Thomas smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude. He had learned that the greatest legacy is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you inspire others to become.